All right, we're back with Dr. Andrew Payne to continue our look at the life and thought of Soren Kierkegaard. In the last episode, we looked at some key events in his life and the relevance of his thought for Christians today. In this episode, we're going to explore, at least begin to explore some of his ideas. So, Andrew, one of the most common summary statements that we see made about Kierkegaard is that he was an existentialist. In fact, many consider him to be the father of modern existentialism. So can you explain to us what the philosophy of existentialism is, and then whether you think that this is an accurate characterization of Kierkegaard's thought?
All right. Yeah. So that's one of those questions. Existentialism, what is it? Best. There's not a lot of agreement that you're ever going to find in like a singular definition. So I think the best you can do to sort of approach that term is take the biggest names in the genre, if you will, and just say, what did they say about it? And of course, the biggest existentialist is Jean-Paul Sartre. He's one of the few that, even though sometimes he did distance himself from the term, he at least did also accept the term a number of times. And he has a famous essay, Existentialism is a Humanism. And that's kind of like his big moment where he's like, I am an existentialist, and this is what this means. But so what does Sartre say it is, right? Well, the big famous line that he uses is that existentialism is when existence precedes essence. And that's the basic line. Now, there's a big open range of philosophies that can claim exactly those words, right? So what does he mean by it in distinction from everybody else? Because, as a Thomist, for example, well, yeah, I mean, Thomists would agree that existence precedes essence. There's nothing about Thomistic or Thomistic ontologies that would prevent us from claiming such a thing. But for Jean-Paul Sartre, there's a lot that he means, but also you can kind of summarize it decently briefly when you say that it's essentially a philosophy of self-creation, self-actualization. First you exist, then you make of yourself what you will, kind of thing. And so we have to recognize, though, that in saying this, the term existence, as he's using it, we maybe can convert that with something like a more classical metaphysical notion of you exist in a genuinely, non-epistemological sense, but in a genuinely metaphysical, ontological sense. But the essence part is where the equivocation would come in. If we just say that existence precedes essence, and this thing called essence is what, human nature, or what is it, right? Like, what do we mean by it? Well, for a Thomist, right, the human essence would be our form in a broad way of speaking, right? It'd be the category of what we are. And so for what Sartre seems to be doing is saying that the category of what we are is to exist, in a sense, and then we make ourselves into something else. But he says something very key, that it's not just that existence precedes essence. He says that in man and man alone, existence precedes essence. And so there's a sense in which, as a Thomist, for example, I would come to that statement and I would look at it and I would say, all right, well, I have man. Man is what I would mean by the essence of the thing, right? Like, I'm existing and I'm an existing human. So the essence there would be the humanness, right? But what Sartre seems to be doing is moving essence one more step down the road, if you will, right? Like, I exist, I'm a man, and now as a man, here's what my essence becomes. And so essence here kind of has an equivocal status with what, classical metaphysicians would mean. And so in essence, this sort of, in essence, what he means here is that basically none of us have the same way of being. How about that? And by way of being, I don't mean, again, in nature. I mean just orientation in life. Heidegger uses the phrase comportment a lot. And what he means isn't exactly what Sartre means here, but we don't, in the Sartrean sense, comport ourselves to the nature of reality, to the world around us in a uniform way. And so variations of this philosophy are found in offshoot thinkers all over France and in the rest of the world. And so people will start making arguments like Frantz Fanon will come along. He's sort of broadly speaking in this Sartrean school, although the two did butt heads a little bit. And so he's going to be making these claims essentially like, well, yeah, so a black way of being is not the same as a white way of being. But what you kind of see the ground of this argument that's going to flourish today, wherein if you're talking about what it is to be human, Well, if you're a white guy, you're probably importing this notion of just whiteness over what it is to be human, something like that, right? And so what's implicit in that is that there are multiple ways to be human, right? And so if there are multiple ways to be human, whatever that way to be human is for Sartre, the truth of an existential position, which is you make it up, right? It's contingent on who you are and what you are, right? So that's broadly speaking what existentialism is. So I guess the next obvious question, or the continuation of this question, is Kierkegaard an existentialist? And the answer to that, in brief, is just no, he's not, right? There's no single passage, as I keep saying, there's no single passage in Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, for that matter, where they say the line or anything remotely approximating existence precedes essence. And so that would be an easy way to say that Kierkegaard is not an existentialist. But there is another subcategory of existentialism. So, for example, if you look it up on the Wikipedia page, as everybody no doubt will, you'll see that there's a Wikipedia page for Christian existentialism, right? Most existentialist books will have, or books sort of on the topic of existentialism, sort of have like a chapter on this, and almost all of them, from what I can tell, is essentially point to Kierkegaard just as the definition of Christian existentialism. So if you're going to define Christian existentialism as whatever Kierkegaard believed, then it's safe to say that Kierkegaard is a Christian existentialist. But does that really tell us very much about what this is, about like what a good definition for it is? Well, not really, given that there's a lot of different interpretations of Kierkegaard. And so perhaps it's safe to say that he is, but I'm kind of a little reticent, if for no other reason than because I think that still blurs the lines between him and the existentialist position. Now, I also say this not to condemn or criticize the existentialist position. I think there's a lot of great things going on in that movement. Particularly, there's certain guys like Lev Shestov who have a kind of fun, aphoristic kind of way of writing that he has a lot of good things to say. And there's various writers. Benjamin Fontaine, for example, writes a book called Existential Monday, has some really great thoughts in there. But the fact of the matter is that it's not really a very useful term to apply to somebody like Kierkegaard. So if he's not an existentialist, what is he? I would argue, and this is kind of a very broad definition, I would argue that Kierkegaard's existential, what gets him lumped in with the existentialists, is because he's, generally speaking, in a broad brushstroke sense, anti-Hegelian. He's not anti-Hegel, he's anti-Hegelian. And that means that he's against something specifically introduced into the culture at that time, into the milieu, like the intellectual milieu. He's against the influence of Hegelianism upon his time. And more than anything, he's against the influence of Hegelianism upon the church, right? And so he wants to separate Christianity from the Hegelian conflation of Christianity with this just sort of broad brushstroke umbrella humanism kind of thing, right? In his time, the two are collapsing together, and he's wanting to more or less separate the two, have it be that I'm not really sure. He does mock Hegel a lot, but it's not exactly ever just this knockdown punch where he's just destroyed Hegel kind of thing.
For the sake of the listener who might not be familiar with Hegelianism, I know it's a very complicated, he's very difficult to read. I struggle to understand what the heck he's saying when I try to read Hegel. Is there any easy way to just explain what it is about Hegel that Kierkegaard is reacting to?
No. So, oh man, you got me with that one. I don't know if I can explain that in any kind of brief way. So essentially, I'll tell you what.
Because I know.
Okay.
So I've been reading Sartre, a little bit of Sartre. I was reading his Existentialism as a Humanism this past week. I've been reading a little bit of Camus.
Yeah.
And these guys seem to reject, from what I understand, their rejection of Hegel is this idea of a progressivism, where Hegel was very optimistic about the future. He felt like history was moving in a definite direction, and that as time goes on, humanity progresses and expresses more of this divine spirit progressively into the future. So I know that the existentialists of which I'm familiar definitely reacted against that idea. So I'm not sure if that's something Kierkegaard was also reacting to.
So there's a really great essay. What's the guy's name? I don't know if I can pronounce it. The book is called Dostoevsky Reads Hegel in Siberia and Bursts into Tears. That's the definition. That's the title of the book. And it's a really interesting book. It's really a collection of essays, and only one of them is on this topic. But the point that he makes there is that he situates essentially Dostoevsky as sort of this progenitor of existentialism. And the idea is that there's the movement of history, and significance for the individual is found in being caught up in the movement of history. And in Hegel, here, for example, he refers to, well, I showed this book, but in a letter, was it? It might actually be in this book. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, he refers to Napoleon, for example, as world spirit on horseback. There's kind of the famous line there. And the fact of the matter is that significance for him is, again, being caught up in not just the movement of history, but even the guy that can reach out, take hold of history for himself and progress it forward according to his will. And so, if you're in a prison camp in Siberia, guess what you're not, right? You're not world spirit on horseback, for one thing, right? Like you're going to essentially be the person that history forgot. And so the existential movement, if you will, for somebody like Dostoevsky, as he's being read in this essay, is to find one's meaning, if you will, find one's significance, relocate the locus of significance out of history and just into the individual themselves and into their own self-causing, self-creating life. Something
I
like
see. So I see. So it's moving away from the collective to the individual.
Yes.
And in that sense, it's existentialist because it's concerned with the living, breathing existence of the individual. Is that basically the point?
Yeah, very much that. And so for Kierkegaard, he's not really terribly concerned with that. There's a lot of readings of him. When I say that, I recognize there are a lot of readings of him that read him entirely through that lens, or at least greatly through that lens. What I would submit is that the general anti-Hegelianism, since Hegel is such a broad thinker, one of my best friends coined this phrase that I think is perfect. He said that after Hegel, there's what he calls the petulant no, which is just people just say no to Hegel, right? Some of them say no in such an uninformed way that they then turn around and immediately repeat some of the things that Hegel said, right? So there's the petulant no is just that there's this general cultural, philosophical anti-Hegelianism. Just get rid of the guy. He's the one to refute.
And what you're describing, does this happen post World Wars, or is it something that happens prior to the catastrophe of the 20th century that disabused a lot of people of the idea that history is progressive and improving, and mankind is realizing the spirit behind it all? But so is this feeling that you're describing? Does this happen prior to the world wars in the 20th century, or is it something that only happens after that? So the latter half of the 19th century is one of those. John Dealey refers to the Dark Ages of philosophy, and the one that he's interested in is like the late medieval period that people just don't pay attention to the people after Aquinas or after Occam. Well, there's a similar problem in the 19th century. You don't hear a lot of people just talk about really any of the writers after 1860, other than Nietzsche, maybe, right? And so after Hegel, there wasn't an anti-Hegelian spirit quite in the same way as there was after World War II. But there was a sense in which you're right about broad brushstroke issues. Let's change what you're saying from a Hegelian philosophy into, for example, a neo-Kantian philosophy. So let's take the philosophy of Immanuel Kant and let's make it more about history. Or you're right about history, Hegel, but let's reduce this to some materialist science like economics or something like that, right? So there's
there's a kind of acceptance and rejection of Hegel afterwards. Or you can be just one of my favorites, Arthur Schopenhauer, and you can just say, I hate you, Hegel. I hate everything about you. I hate you. I hate you. I hate you. And then just turn around and go back and just do pure Kant, right? Like you can just do that. Outside in the 19th century, I would say there were not that many just petulant no anti-Hegelians. Right. Kierkegaard, I would argue, was not a petulant no anti-Hegelian. And sometimes there's one of the more influential readings of Nietzsche, for example, comes from Gilles Deleuze, a 20th century French philosopher. I think he died in the early 90s, to give you an idea of his era. And he in his book on Nietzsche says that you misunderstand Nietzsche if you don't understand who his target is. And then he says, and Nietzsche's target was Hegel. And that's just a brutally false statement. Like it's not even remotely close to accurate, because literally at several points, Nietzsche defends Hegel against Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is Nietzsche's target, right? And so Walter Kaufmann does a really good job at bringing that out in his book on Nietzsche, if you're interested. But anyway, the point would end up being, though, that the really petulant no anti-Hegelianism that just sort of popped up was after the influential lectures of a few guys. There's a guy, Jean Hippolyte. So he wrote that book. He also wrote a number of books actually on Hegel. One of them is a really good book, The Introduction to Hegel's Philosophy of History. If you just want like a brief read to get a grasp on it, I'm not sure there's a better one than that. And it's like really brief. Most of these are lectures that he gave. There's another guy, what's his name? Forget it. Yeah, Alexander Kojev. This might actually be what caused all the anti-Hegelianism sentiments, because these guys were teachers in University of Paris, I believe the Sorbonne, so the same place John Calvin went. And so they were teachers, and they were writing the very end of the interest in Hegel. Like there was a kind of resurgent interest in Hegel at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And they were in France, the dominant figures that shaped this. They synthesized it with a general kind of Marxism. And so you have this Hegelian Marxist philosophy that takes over the university. Excuse me. And so this Hegelian Marxist philosophy is what they're putting forward as the true spirit of Marx as well. And so you have all of these May 1968 revolutionaries that are really dissatisfied with that reading of Marx. And so then they say as well, we're also wanting, the real problem is this Hegelian thing. And they just start with kind of, again, the petulant no, just saying no to all of that and turning around and immediately then inventing what we now call postmodernism, essentially. So you have like Derrida's one of the guys that was in these classes. Deleuze was in the classes, or was in these classes. And it's worth stressing, though, that petulant no Hegelianism is not to be found in Jean-Paul Sartre. So he's unfortunately known as a philosopher who thought of himself as a Heideggerian. Some might even claim that he's trying to do Heideggerian philosophy, and that's just blatantly false.
He certainly tries, at the very least, he tries to write in that kind of style. Well, which I find extremely annoying, that writing style.
Well, I would argue that he's not so much writing in a Heideggerian style, that he does have his own kind of style. Because Heidegger just makes up terms half the time that he doesn't even bother to define, and then doesn't seem to be terribly consistent, and he doesn't really care for you to track with him. And if you read Sartre next to Heidegger, one of them is way easier than the other.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just this continental, I guess, tendency to write in a way that's elusive. Yeah, and rather than crisp and clear. Well, and like Aristotle and Aquinas.
Exactly.
So anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take us so far afield away from Kierkegaard, but to reel it back into Kierkegaard. Okay, so Kierkegaard, you were saying before that he could be considered existentialist insofar as he was also reacting against the Hegelianism of his time.
And this is, to bring us back to the passage I was looking up. So in the Phenomenology of Spirit, near the end, we're in the section on religion. If you have this version, is the version at every Barnes & Noble, right? It's page 460, subsection 759. if you have a different edition. So Hegel ends that section with a line that spirit is known as self-consciousness, and to this self-consciousness, it is immediately revealed for spirit. Here it is. For spirit is the self-consciousness itself. And here's the big line. The divine nature is the same as the human, and it is this unity that is beheld. All right. I'll read that again. The divine nature is the same as the human, and it is this unity that is beheld. Now, I think I mentioned last time that Kierkegaard's main Hegelian that he's targeting is his teacher, Hans Lassen Martensen. But he also probably, I think, has in mind Ludwig Feuerbach, who took that line to heart, essentially, and argued that theology and anthropology are really the same thing. That when theology realizes its true nature, it realizes that this is really just all about man in the first place, right? That the divine nature has become the human nature, and therefore what we are exploring is the fullness of the human, right? And so Feuerbach's notion even is that essentially the idea of alienation, like man being alienated from his nature, gets introduced here. And so we are alienated from our natures insofar as we see the fullness of human potential is split between the divine reality and the human reality, right? So man has limited knowledge, but God has unlimited knowledge, something like that, right? And so what Feuerbach is arguing is that there are no true limits to human knowing. And so what we are progressively coming to realize is that absolute understanding is in man, that kind of divine absolution is actually still man at the end of the day. And so, again, theology is going to now collapse into anthropology, the study of...
When you say man, he means man collectively, not man individually.
Yes. Good point. That's a good point. Yeah. It's the human, if you will, right? And so Kierkegaard is, I think, as an Orthodox Christian and as a pietist, rightly reacting against that, right? That there's no more true historical Christianity if you have now collapsed the idea of God into the idea of man. And so his anti-Hegelianism is saying no to that specific point and saying, let's tear those two apart, right? And so let's show how there's a line that he uses over and over again. For example, in The Lily of the Fields and the Birds of the Air, there's a really great translation of that Princeton just released, by the way, translated by Bruce Currency. I think it's like $14, but it's a really good one to read. And he says there, the line, and again, he says it a number of other places too, but that God is in heaven and you are on earth, right? He repeats that line over and over again in his writings. And it's a really important line because what is he doing there? He's saying, no, these two are not colliding. They're properly being separated, right? And so Hegel, for example, in the preface of his second edition of The Science of Logic, has this really great section where he talks about language. And he talks about how, for Hegel, Hegelian philosophy is reason coming into its own fullness. And so broad brushstroke, really quick sort of statement of what that means. I think it's important to go back to Descartes here. So with Descartes, there's this invention of this thing called reason with a capital R. Beforehand, nobody would be asking the question of what is reason. They would be talking about reasoning, like it's a verb. It's not a noun, right? It's not something with an essence that we're describing. It's a verb. It's something that you do, right? And so with Descartes, the invention of this thing called reason sort of emerges. Man, for Descartes, he asked the question, is man a rational animal? That's the classical Aristotelian definition. And he says, no, man is just a rational thing, right? A thinking thing. So it's important to stress that what that essentially means is that when we're talking about reason with a capital R, we're talking also about the same thing, we're denoting the same thing as the human essence, right? So we're talking about man and reason are basically synonyms at this point, right? So when you're now unpacking what it is to be human, you're unpacking also the definition of this thing, reason. And that also helps us, by the way, with this existentialist definition, because what is Sartre now saying when he says existence precedes the essence of what it is to be human? There is no capital R thing called reason anymore for Sartre, right? That it becomes this sort of this fragmented type thing that we all do subjectively, right? But so on our working our way from Descartes to Hegel, though, what Hegel is getting to is this idea, well, yeah, okay, we are this thinking thing. There's this capital R, excuse me, there's this capital R thing called reason, right? And this capital R thing called reason, though, didn't just pop into existence fully formed, understanding itself, because if we humans are what it is to reason, right? Well, we're growing in our understanding. We are progressing. We are becoming more rational as we advance. Science is getting better, for example. There's that notion of progress. And so if science is getting better, if reason is growing in its own self-understanding, then what essentially we're looking at in Hegel's day is where reason finally realizes its true essence. It achieves true absolution. And that's sort of that divine nature that he's really talking about there. And so this opening passage in the Science of Logic, he says really what we do is we trace the development of reason through language, that language itself gets better and better and better. And so I've studied, for example, I've studied a little bit of cuneiform, like Sumerian, the Sumerian language, like, which is a cuneiform form of language. And it's really funny because there's words like lugal, which we would translate as king, which what it means is great man, right? But the word lu is going to be man, and gal is going to be great. So how do you say great king? Because literally lugal, right, is great man. So how do you say great king? You say lugal gal, great man, great, right? Like it's kind of this really crude kind of language right there, right? Like it just, as you're studying the language, you really do realize, yeah, we've come a long way. Like this is a different kind of complexity here than there is in, German, Hegel's language. And so Hegel's point then is that language has come into its greatest essence here in this, in the German language, that the German language has more potential to come into this self-understanding, this absolution, than any other language in history beforehand. And so he's celebrating just the great achievements of human language. And Kierkegaard then comes along, and the lily of the fields and the birds of the air, and he says, yes, the ability to speak, it is such a great thing. It sets man above the animals. But remember, we can't even still speak with God, right? That we don't speak a divine language. You are in God is in heaven and you are on earth, and we can't really properly speak to each other. And so you have to recognize what you are before God, that in order for us to even pretend to speak to God, he has to condescend so far that it's a literally infinite gap that he is moving across, right? And so Kierkegaard's point is, sure, yeah, we're advancing as human beings with language. That's wonderful, but that has no way, shape or form moves us closer to divinity, right? And it moves us closer to God. And so again, he's reasserting that same point of the divine essence and the human essence do not collapse together. They cannot collapse together. The only reason why we would ever think that they could collapse together is because we've already just anthropomorphized God to the degree that we just have failed to think what he is properly, right?
Let me try to see if I have these categories in my mind now. I feel like I'm understanding more as you're talking. So let me present this to you and you can tell me if I'm off. So with Descartes, we have the separation of reason with capital R from the individual reasoning.
Yeah.
Right? So if Descartes does that, then reason with a capital R seems to be what is common among all human beings. So reason with a capital R kind of ranges over all humans. And it would be kind of a small step from there for someone like Hegel to come in and say, that reason that ranges over all human beings is actually the divine spirit expressing itself in the world, basically. Yeah. And insofar as that reason with a capital R develops, and we can see it developing through more sophisticated languages, and of course he has his dialectical advance, Hegel does, to that degree, the spirit, the absolute spirit itself, is coming to fruition, is expressing itself, is fully being developed. And so what happens is there's a disassociation of the individual with reason. Is that what you're saying? And so it becomes this collective realization of the Spirit of God. Humanity becomes this collective realization of the Spirit of God and identifies basically the human spirit understood as reason and the divine spirit. Is that what's happening here? And then this is what Kierkegaard's reacting to.
Yeah, very much so. I think that's a really good way to put it. And the thing is, there's a natural gap between the individual participating in this common essence and then the fullness of the essence, right? And bridging that gap is kind of, or rather maybe the impossibility of bridging that gap is where a lot of the later existentialists sort of camp out, right? And what Kierkegaard is sort of dealing with here is to say that, well, actually, you've already made a category mistake if you think of God as this collective essence thing, because there's in the Thomistic world, to sort of drop a hopefully not overly complicated idea, right? With the cosmological argument, it's important to say that Aquinas is not abstracting from individual created things to get to God as just the highest abstraction, right? Because you don't abstract your way to God, even if God may be more like conceptualized in abstract language, that doesn't mean he's an abstract being, right? And so you don't get to God via just sort of abstracting that, okay, you have, Andrew, and then you have man, and then you have animal, and then you have created thing, right? You don't just eventually work your way there to finally have now the category of God, right? In Thomistic language, the category of the existence of all created things is called esse communa, right? Like it's just the common form of to be, the common form of existing. And in a lot of accounts of Aquinas, people mistake that category for God. And they think that that's what Aquinas is getting at when he is giving forth the cosmological argument, because they think that he's just abstracting his way to God. But what have we actually gotten to? Well, we've gotten to the highest created way of being, right? We haven't gotten to the creator. But insofar as we've already made that mistake, we just abstracted our way to God, then if God's hovering out as this just sort of highest abstraction of what it is to be a created thing, then it's going to be really easy to collapse him into the creation, right? And that's essentially the mistake that Hegel's making here, right? That he's not dealing with the transcendent God beyond created being, right? He's not talking about, to use the Latin phrase ipsum esse subsistens, self-subsisting being, right? Self-creating being in a sense, right? He's instead, what would be the easiest way to put this? He started off already with a category mistake. And instead, he's essentially saying that it's not that God is the greatest of created beings, but he is the greatest transcendental being, if you will. He doesn't use the term transcendental, but I think that that's worth us using here, like sort of implying, because what that means is that the transcendental in Hegel's time, in the sort of the post-Kantian time, is the framework of human consciousness, right? What it is to talk about the transcendentals is to talk about, if human consciousness is a building, right, then this is the framework of this building. And so there is no building without the framework, but you can never call the framework beyond the building, right? It still is in the building in a sense, right? And so even the walls of the building would still be technically part of the building. And so you haven't moved beyond the building. And so if we have abstracted our way to the framework and we call God the biggest transcendental being rather than the biggest transcendent being, right? What we have just discovered then is simply the framework of the same house. And we just fail to now realize that this is not God, right? So Hegel's just saying, oh yeah, it's the same house. No, it's not. God is something completely different. And Kierkegaard is moving in and trying to show us that we're not speaking of God in univocal terms. We're speaking of God in analogical terms, right? That we need a doctrine of analogy after this to make sense of all of Christian doctrine. And so he's pushing, now he doesn't use the language of analogy, that's me inserting that, but the point is that after reading Kierkegaard, you're reminded of why the medieval spent so much time saying the doctrine of analogy shapes how we talk about God, rather than just sort of treating kind of crudely this language of God in univocal terms, that to be, well, it's the same for us as it is for God, right? No, he doesn't exist like us, right? And this is a fact that Kierkegaard is again and again and again coming back to and repeating.
As you're talking there, I think maybe some of our listeners might be wondering, it sounds almost like Hegel is he a pantheist? I mean, I don't know if Hegel would be a pantheist, because he doesn't identify every aspect of reality with God. It's just the human spirit, right, that becomes God. It's the rational aspect of humanity collectively that is the unfolding of the absolute spirit. Would you place Hegel as some kind of a pantheist, some form of, or maybe panentheism?
Yeah. So that's a really hotly debated issue with Hegel. A lot of the big name scholars that I would cite really strongly resist that.
Yeah.
And I'll put it this way. I'm unsure myself where to put him. I know that the Hegel scholarship resists it. Hegel himself claimed to have been from start to finish an Orthodox Lutheran the whole time. I think that's safe to say that he wasn't.
Yeah.
But
because it almost sounds like Spinoza in some ways.
Oh, he was heavily influenced by Spinoza. Yeah, he was heavily influenced by Spinoza, openly. And so he's also coming just on the other side of what's called the pantheism controversy in German thought, wherein this guy, these two German thinkers, I don't need to go into them too much, but these two German thinkers were corresponding back and forth in philosophical letters. And then one of them took the letters where they were kind of openly admitting that they're pantheists now and published them. And the other guy is kind of going, hey, wait, what happened? And one of the guys that gets caught up in this is Immanuel Kant, whose final uncompleted work is called the Opus Posthumum. And he seems to be making these, Etienne Gilson, for example, an author that we both very much like. Etienne Gilson reads that as Kant later coming out as a pantheist, because that's just sort of the movement that's taken over German thinking. Frederick Copleston, though, who's written that really colorful, 10-volume series on the history of philosophy, definitely worth your money, by the way, if you're watching. It's the greatest history of philosophy ever written. He comes along and I think adequately argues that Kant is not collapsing into pantheism, because if you've read any of this, it's an incompleted book. And so you'll have pages like that, which are clearly just notes, right?
Yeah.
And so these are incompleted thoughts. And so Copleston disabuses us of the idea that Kant is collapsing into pantheism. But the point is, everybody seems to be. And Hegel's
right.
on the other side of that.
It was the intellectual mood of the day. And so really what's happening is a collapsing, whether it's a pantheism or not, there's a collapsing of the creator-creature divide.
Right.
There's some level of collapse happening, and there's some level of identity that's going on between at least that rational aspect of man, which for Descartes and afterwards is the whole of man.
Yeah.
And God, in some sense, in some way, the divine spirit, whatever that means for Hegel, is itself the manifestation of God in man collectively. And it sounds like what Kierkegaard's doing is trying to restore that creator-creature divide that exists from, the time of, I would say, Plato and Aristotle all the way through Plotinus and into the high medievals and early reformers. Is that an accurate way to maybe put it, broadly speaking?
Yeah, I would argue that that's exactly what he is, which is why I would then say, so if he's not an existentialist, what is he? I would call him just sort of a neo-reformer, right? He is seeing the church has kind of collapsed into a whole lot of theological decadence, and so it needs to be reformed again, except now he is a Christian missionary to Christians, to use Mark Tesian's, the title of Mark Tesian's book again. He's a Christian missionary to Christians, which means he is a reformer to the Reformed Church, if you will.
That is a extremely, even as you're talking here, I just feel like my understanding of what's going on with Kierkegaard is it's just being enlightened. So this is really good. Just to circle back, maybe to put a bow on this conversation. So he's definitely not, he's existentialist then in the sense that he wants to focus back down on the individual. He wants to disassociate the individual, at least to a certain extent, from the collective. And he wants to place that individual back in a position of radical dependency upon the creator. He wants to focus our attention back on that creator-creature divide. He wants to disassociate the idea that somehow God is being expressed through the collective rationality of mankind, and he wants to now that I'm remembering what I've read of Kierkegaard and listening to you talk, it's almost like he wants to bring us back to that point where we see our radical dependence on the creator and where we see the radical distinction between ourselves as individuals and God.
100%.
Okay, good. Yeah.
to add to that, just one thing, there's what Martin Luther has the distinction between what he calls the coram mundo and the coram deo. Coram mundo means just sort of the before the world, and then coram deo being before God, right? And so there's two ways that we can look at ourselves. In Hegelian language, there's two ways we are mediated, right? That I understand myself before the world, before you now, before the YouTube community, before just all of my peers, right? History maybe, right? That we can appraise ourselves in that sense, and we can appraise ourselves before God. And these two do not mix. They are not the same thing. And so if the overarching question of Kierkegaard is what does it mean to be a Christian, then one of the things that immediately falls out of this sort of his form of anti-Hegelianism is that the Christian achievement, what it is to be a Christian, sort of to walk the Christian life, is not something approximated or measured by the advancement of history. And so if you think about the great men of history kind of deal, right? Some of them might be Christians, but that doesn't make them great Christians. I mean, this is a basic teaching from Jesus, right? And so the point being that the advancement of Christendom, for example, has been as an historical force, as a kind of, Christendom as the embodiment of the church and as kind of like the political embodiment of the church in history, has sort of become the measurement in Kierkegaard's day of the greatness of the Christian. So the King of Denmark is going to be a great Christian as insofar as he's advancing the will of the church. Meanwhile, the person who is just living the quiet life, sort of removed from the rest of this historical enterprise, is now an insignificant Christian. And so Kierkegaard's coming along and he's saying, yeah, that's conflating, that's blending together the coram mundo and the coram deo, the self before God and the self before man. Before God, kings and paupers stand side by side, judged alike, and receive salvation alike. And their worldly deeds make, in that sense, no difference. No, doesn't matter how many peoples he's conquered, doesn't matter, how much economic progress he's produced, what kind of technological innovations he's achieved. None of that translates into mattering in any capacity in the coram deo, in the self before God sense. And so Kierkegaard's reminding everybody that, yeah, because we are not God, we're not advancing God or God's projects when we're advancing history. And so we need to realize that Christianity has brought us back to now this self before God. So the individual here is being elevated, yes, but in a deeply historically Christian sense, to say that, yeah, no, it's Jesus died for us individually.
That's great. That's great. So just to conclude here, so there is a sense in which Kierkegaard is the father of existentialism, but we have to be very careful about in what way, in what sense we are using that word existentialism to Kierkegaard. And just listening to you talk, it's become clear in my mind exactly what that means. So, but we also have to be very careful not to identify him with the later existentialists who were atheists. I mean, when I'm reading Jean-Paul Sartre or when I'm reading Albert Camus, clearly these guys start from that great Nietzschean declaration that God is dead. That God is dead. There is no God. There is no foundation anymore for universal moral norms or the idea of fixed essences or even the idea of that there's an intelligible universe and that we are part of that intelligible. They begin with a rejection of all of this, and their philosophy takes off from that principle. But that is not Kierkegaard. That is not Kierkegaard. And I think it's because these guys are so associated with this Nietzschean idea that they begin with the principle that there is no God, that I think that confuses people when they see Kierkegaard as the father of existentialism. So really great. Any final thoughts there?
Yeah, I will say this. You mentioned the death of God there, and what Nietzsche is pointing to with the death of God, I think we need to also situate it a little bit, because it does add a nice little wrinkle. And that is that what has died, this absolute has died in this Hegelian sense, right? That's what we've moved beyond. It's the fragmentation of all this, which makes it a little bit of a tenuous thing to sort of move beyond. Because, for example, as a Thomist, I never believed that absolute existed anyway, right? So there's a little bit of a wrinkle that does pop up, and we can address that in a future episode and whatnot.
I would love to do that. Yeah, love to do it. And I would love to do a series on Nietzsche as well. Maybe we can do that. because I think there are a lot of confusions in my own confusions regarding his thought as well.
Yeah. Well, and just so one last thing with Kierkegaard, just to say, sort of sum up that whole point. For Kierkegaard, everything is about seeking after God first. And we do that as individuals, right? We do that as those who are called individually to God, right? Called by God to him, right? And so the emphasis there is emphatically on the individual, but again, radically in a Christian historical sense.
In a very, yes, healthy Christian historical sense, whereas the later existentialists are, especially after the world wars, are going to react to this idea of a collective progressive spirit of mankind that is only progressing and reaching higher and higher levels of existence. And their reaction is going to be, there is no essence to humanity whatsoever, right? And we need to be individuals in a very radical sense, that all we are like this bare power of self-determination. So even insofar as we can determine what we are in our essence. And so I can see that now. I can see the kind of rejection of Hegelianism that we see in these later existentialist thinkers versus a rejection that Kierkegaard makes. And Kierkegaard's going to go back to something that was earlier and healthier, whereas the later existentialists end up in utter catastrophe. Anyway, Andrew, another fantastic conversation here, and I'm just really excited for the next one.